Good evening. I'm Elizabeth White Erickson, and I and Kelly Hubbard are the conference editors for the Public Land and Resources Law Review. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 31st Annual Public Land Law Conference, and I thank you all for being here with us this evening. This conference has a very rich history. It is the legacy of the late Marjorie Hunter Brown, who was a leader in the areas of public land, natural resources, and environmental law, and Indian law. Each year, the goal of the conference is to present a contemporary issue of regional and national importance and to encourage dialogue in these areas of law and policy. The conference provides a unique opportunity for professionals in these areas to come together and exchange ideas, insights, and information. To that end, this year's conference will bring together a diverse program of nationally recognized experts and key regional players in the area of energy law and policy to address the role of the Rocky Mountain region in broader national and international energy debates. The keynote address this evening will kick off the conference, which will continue tomorrow and Wednesday. For a schedule of conference events, please visit our registration table outside. And I would also like to invite all of you to a reception following the talk tonight at the Clark Fork Coalition. And we will have directions and maps to the reception as you leave the theater. Finally, I would like to thank the School of Law and the Public Policy Research Institute, the Office of the President, and the editors and staff of the Public Land and Resources Law Review, and especially Kelly Hubbard and Sarah Van de Wettering for their hard work in making this event possible. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and now President George Dennison will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here this evening. I have the distinct honor and the very great pleasure to open the program this evening and to introduce our keynote speaker for the 31st Annual Public Land Law Conference. The Public Land and Resources Law Review provides a relevant and ongoing forum for regional and national dialogue related to public land, natural resource, and environmental and Indian law and policy, and sponsors this conference to broaden and enrich the resultant dialogue. The Law Review sponsors the annual Public Land Law Conference with the organizational work done by some of the people you've already met, but in any case, I think it's appropriate that I should introduce them, and then we'll have a round of applause for them. The Board of Student Editors, this year ably led by Executive Editors Amy Scott Smith and Helen Thigpen, and conference co-editors Kelly Hubbard and Elizabeth Erickson. So let's have a round of applause for those. Professor Ray Cross of the School of Law provides faculty support, and Dean Ed Eck, who's with us this evening, assures generous financial support for both the Law Review and the annual conference. Now, as occurred last year, I think for the first time, the University of Montana's Public Policy Research Institute partners with the Law Review student leaders and the School of Law to organize and present this year's program. So I want publicly to commend Sarah Van de Wettering, Will Harmon, and Matt Kenny for the Institute for their timely example of cross-campus collaboration. So give them a round of applause, please. It's also appropriate that I take this occasion to acknowledge the following organizations for their financial support of the conference this year: the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, Bennett Law Office, New West Net, the Sierra Club, Western Progress, Exergy Development Group, LLC, and the Montana State Bar Natural Resources, Energy, and Environmental Law Section. Let's thank them as well. Now, in designing this year's program, the student organizers and their partners leaned heavily on the expertise of the Public Land and Resource National Advisory Board. This board includes prominent experts from across the country with diverse perspectives on natural resource, environmental, and Native American issues. We have 3 of the board members with us this evening, and I'd like to recognize them and have you help me recognize them. Professor Ray Cross, who does double duty, Rebecca Watson, and Steve Doherty. Let's recognize them, please. Now, as all of you know from the introduction a moment ago, this year's conference focuses on the role of the Rocky Mountain states in moving toward a more sustainable energy policy. Based on all that I know about her and having enjoyed prior opportunities to hear her speak, I have great confidence that you will leave this evening inspired to think broadly about energy leadership because of the insight and the expertise of our distinguished keynote speaker. No stranger to Montana, our speaker knows the West and the University of Montana exceptionally well. Dr. Patricia Limerick, professor of history, University of Colorado, a nationally renowned historian, serves as the faculty chair of the board and co-founder of the Center of the American West of the University of Colorado. She has dedicated her career to bridging the gap between academics and the general public, and to demonstrating the benefits of applying historical perspective to contemporary dilemmas and conflicts. Her best-known work, The Legacy of Conquest, 1987, offers an engaging and compellingly readable overview and reinterpretation of Western American history that has stirred a great deal of academic and public debate. In 1995, Dr. Limerick accepted a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, an award that appropriately recognized her accomplishments while providing a foundation for the significant work that has appeared since 2000 or remains in progress. In 2001, she received the Hazel Barnes Award, the University of Colorado's highest recognition of teaching and research excellence. Energy topics have become an important focus at the center of the American West in recent years, largely as a result of the influence of Professor Limerick. She served as the co-author of 2 recent major reports on related subjects of concern to those of us who live in the West. What Every Westerner Should Know About Energy, that was in 2003, and What Every Westerner Should Know About Energy Efficiency and Conservation, just this year. I know that I speak for all when I express our excitement at the prospect of this evening's lecture and discussion. Tonight, we of the University of Montana have the honor once again to host Dr. Patricia Limerick for a presentation exploring the topic of Rocky Mountain energy leadership. Based on the conversation during dinner this evening, I know you will enjoy and learn a great deal from her insightful comments and cogent observations. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the campus and the podium Professor Patricia Limerick.
That was a very, very kind introduction. Thank you for that. Thank you, President and Mrs. Dennison, for your kindness and hospitality and warmth. Thank you, Elizabeth and Kelly, Sarah, Matt, Will. And these are lucky young people and lucky middle-aged people to be working together on this. And I won't say which is which. You'll have to guess that. And lucky me to be part of this. So the core of my speech tonight will be suggestions on how to enhance the power of the Rockies. And if all goes as planned in technology, you'll get to see a little 5-minute snippet of a project that we're undertaking to add power and vitality to public discussion of that. But before I get to those suggestions, I have to say that I'm struck by the fact that I used to be in Missoula, I would say once or twice a year, every year for the first 5 or 6 years of the 1990s, and then a little bit after that, and then it seemed to drop away, and I didn't seem to be in Missoula, and then, or in Bozeman, or a number of other places. I don't know what happened there. Perhaps I had spoken often enough that people in Montana said, well, that will do it. The wonderful Vine Deloria, who died recently, a year and a half ago, he came up to me once in Colorado, and he said, you know, Patty, I understand the legislature finally passed that bill. I said, oh, what bill is that? He said, well, the law that now means if 4 people want to get together in the state of Colorado and they don't want Patty Limerick to speak, well, now there's a permitting process you can go through to keep that from happening. So maybe something similar happened in Montana, and there was a dropping away of invitations. And while I was not visiting here as often as I used to, one of your many, many wonderful writers here, Thomas McGuane, wrote a book called The Cadence of Grass, and I had the interesting experience of sitting in the Denver airport on my way out of town reading The Cadence of Grass, and on page 10 I was struck by the introduction of a character. Mr. McGuane had named this character Dr. Edith Crusoe, who was described as a Westerness at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And in a further description, Thomas McGuane told us that partisan hyperbole had made Dr. Crusoe not just a professor, but a public intellectual in the Rockies. Well, it goes on from there. We're at the early scenes in the novel. We're at a funeral for a man who had a Coca-Cola bottling plant, and one of the characters imagines that when Dr. Crusoe thinks of this man, she would write about the descendants of mammoth hunters being bludgeoned into an ecological black hole by waves of coercive white men on horseback wielding Coca-Cola bottles. When she's browsing at a travel prospectus, Dr. Crusoe thinks to herself and says to others, skiing, snowmobiling, lake sailing, trout fishing, you name it. Clearly the locals think that the water will last forever. This mess began with the last Homestead Act and won't end until desertification turns the West into a vast parking lot for sport utility vehicles. These are happy times for anyone untroubled by the extinction of wildlife and the destruction of the countryside. And when we last see Professor Crusoe, she's in a bar in a Montana hotel at mid-morning, and someone raises the uncomfortable question with Dr. Crusoe and asks her if she's still teaching, and she says, I'll need a drink before I answer that, she says. And very soon after that, she is starting a conga line in the bar. So that's what happens. I stay out of Montana for a few years, and look what happens to my reputation and my image. I was very fortunate. I got a chance to write Mr. McGuane a letter recently, and it was very fun to sign up Patricia Limerick, parentheses, a.k.a. Dr. Edith Crusoe. Let that go. So I will have to come more regularly, so that doesn't happen again. I'm staying at the Doubletree, which used to be the Red Lion Inn, which I myself, based on the number of remarkable experiences there, it's the only place in my life I ever thought I saw a ghost, which is a whole other story. But I would rename it the Anecdote Inn or the Parable Hotel, because interesting things have always happened to me there. And one of them introduces my real theme of the evening, which is connectivity and connection. So I shall tell the story of what happened to me once. I shall tell it with a certain amount of vagueness involving time and place and companionship for reasons that you'll see. So some time ago, I was staying at what was the Red Lion Inn, it's now the Doubletree, and I arrived at the same time with a friend who was on the same plane who had been enjoying himself on the trip up here, and he arrived with a different blood level than I had. And so he proposed that we meet for dinner when we got here. So fortunately, that's a nice restaurant. It was back then, too. So we went into the restaurant, and we were having dinner there, and he was continuing to enjoy himself, and he ordered a few more drinks. And then entirely to my surprise, I shouldn't say a bit, I was struck by how much he was taking in there. And then I was really struck because he fell silent, and he had passed out, though he was still seated upright. And so I thought, well, this is a dilemma. And now we get to the point of connectivity and connection. It wasn't my problem in a sense, but it seemed like it was my problem. There didn't seem to be any way to detach myself from that situation. Although at first I thought, I don't know what to do. And I do have the mystery I was reading on the plane. So maybe I'll get that out and see if I can finish that. That was a interesting mystery. Well, I discovered if you're ever in this situation, I can tell you that's not going to work, because you can't concentrate on even a pretty compelling plot under those circumstances. So finally I said to the maitre d', I said, the waiter, I'm going to need the maitre d's help. So the maitre d' came over. I said, well, I'm having a little problem here, but we're staying in the hotel, and I wonder if you could help me. I think between the two of us, we could get him to his room. And so then I thought, once we attempted that, a better eye for space would have noticed you can't walk three abreast in most restaurants. So the maitre d' was of no use to me at all. And I had never done this before, so I had my companion by his elbows, and that doesn't work well at all. And so people were grabbing for their water glasses, and as we kind of caromed through the room there. And then I thought, this can't be the only way to do this. On war movies, when you're taking your fallen comrade off, you grab his arm here and you hold his arm here and you get your other hand there. So it's worth a try. So I tried that, and then it was great. We could aim, we could do a slalom. We were good. We were really good. So we're moving along, and the maitre d' said, well, I don't think you need my help. I said, well, I think I disagree with that, because he has his keys in his pocket, and we're going to his room, so I think you better come with me. So we got him to his room, and I didn't quite know what to do, but he said he was a little bit conscious then. He said he would be okay. So the next morning he called, and it turned out to be a little bit of a bonding experience. We were very good friends afterwards. He referred many times, not many times, but several times with other people there to this story. Okay, so that is a story of connectivity and helping someone who was having a dilemma that was not directly my own. But now what I would like to get to is how that kind of connectivity and responsiveness will put you into such a tangle of opportunity and tragedy and joy. So the second chapter of this story is that about 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a friend's house, and I was telling this interesting story about helping a somewhat temporarily disabled friend out of a restaurant. And as I was describing the different lifts I had tried, I could see that people weren't really quite following my description. So my husband was there, and a wonderful friend named Houston Kempton, who I'd known for years. He was there, and several other people. I said, well, I just need to demonstrate this. No one's quite following my story, so I need someone to play a very drunk person. And this good friend Houston said, well, I will play the drunk person. And so he did a fine job. He went quite limp, and I carried him around the room, showing everybody this thing. As I carried my friend around the room, I thought, this is a pleasant experience. I thought he's an attractive fellow, and I hope people will ask for more reenactments of this story. This is a pleasant way to spend the evening. It's not what you call a parlor game, but it's more fun than most of those. So that was my only moment of an inappropriate thought towards this person. Then tragedy enters the story, and some very really rough things happen. My husband dies of a stroke. Houston gets divorced, and a divorce he didn't want. One thing leads to another, and guess who's getting married on November 4th? And so the only moment where I had inappropriate thoughts about this person was reenacting a scene from the Doubletree. So it's just been really interesting to be in that restaurant and to think of all the curious ways in which our... so that is a story about tragedy and joy and connectivity, and that is why it should be renamed the Parable Hotel, if you ask me, because there's a story from each of my visits. That larger theme of connectivity and connection is the story of my life for the last 10 or 15 years. I have been privileged to hang out with many, many, many different constituencies and interest groups in the American West. I am constantly unsettled. I am never permitted to live comfortably with a stereotype or an unexamined assumption. I am forever having to change my mind. I am forever having my assumptions and convictions tossed around by the places where I am meeting people, empathizing with people, hearing their side of the story. It's not in the least a comfortable life, but it is a great life, and that is the framework for some of my thoughts tonight. The Center has done these reports on energy. These are, I guess they could be door prizes if you don't have one. If there's a way to raise money for next year's conference, we could do that. I can't, as a charitable contribution, I would want to bid on this, but I can't because I have many copies of my own, so it'd be ridiculous to buy one for myself, but possibly I could bid on someone else's behalf. So here's what every Westerner should know about energy and what every Westerner should know about energy conservation and efficiency. And I should say that the main reason I wanted to waive those reports is to say that, again, they have brought us into all kinds of circles. For 4 years now, I've been a regular attender at the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, Rocky Mountain Natural Gas Strategy Conference, for instance. Those are circles I hadn't expected to be hanging out in, but with these reports have ended up there. But more to the point, what I wanted to say right now is that we are experimenting with some different forms of communication, which you'll see very graphically in a moment. When we did our draft of our energy efficiency and conservation report, well, there's competition for this prize, but I think it was the dullest manuscript on the planet. When we finished the first draft, we thought, this is not looking good. The young people at the center in our conversations took to using a phrase. They'd say, well, it's very hard to make that interesting because energy efficiency and conservation is just not a sexy topic. So they used that phrase several times to the point where I finally thought, well, then that's what we'll do. We'll make it sexy. And as soon as I said that, we thought, well, for heaven's sake, that metaphor is everywhere. America's romance with fossil fuels, America's love affair with petroleum. So why not? So that is the approach we took. This report begins with the lines, which you'll hear again in a moment. we may not know your name, but we already know one pretty private thing about you. You have been involved in a tempestuous relationship, pursuing a mad romance with fossil fuel. So, time to build a new relationship. That's the framework for that report. And I think anybody who's looked at that, including some great experts in that field, agree that it is the liveliest report on the subject of energy efficiency and conservation. It is the only report that came close in early and middle drafts to being sent around in a brown paper wrapper. It's the only report on these issues that follows an erotic metaphor through much of the text, not all the text, but some of the text. We decided finally, we made some important compromises because we want it usable in high schools. And so that's important. So one thing led to another with that, and for the people in the audiovisual booth, I'm getting pretty close to wanting to show this little 5-minute example of what we're doing with the film. So the next step, one of our board members and donors said he thought that we were doing everything you could do with print, but that there was a next step of getting the center's message and more energized communications out to the world that we could only do if we tried film. So with his help, we were able to get going on a film, which will show you our 5-minute promo in a moment. It contrasts the Old West, the New West, and the Next West in terms of energy use. It uses those two historical frameworks and one anticipatory future framework to try to jolt us out of taking our energy habits of both production and consumption for granted. These terms, Old West, New West, Next West, are not the most sharply defined concepts. In fact, the phrase New West has, I'm sorry to say, always struck me as a kind of a weird choice. Every other entity in the world, as it goes through time, it begins as a young entity, a new entity, and it becomes an old, aged entity, and the West somehow or other managed to reverse that. The Old West comes before the New West. So that finally allowed me to live up to the honor of my surname, and here is a limerick on that subject. The West has been lucky, it's true. It did not grow old. It grew new. It grew new. Excuse me, you can't. Okay, let's try that one more time. It's an art form, the limerick cuts. The West has been lucky, it's true. It did not grow old, it grew new. As it got older, it got fresher and bolder. Don't you wish that could happen to you? Don't get your hopes up, is basically this story from that one. So what I would like to do is say that in this film, we are trying to reverse the inadvertent Calvinism that comes into many environmental communications. I asked myself during graduate school and after graduate school, I thought, why did we have to spend so much time reading those Puritans? Why did we have to read those Puritans? Well, now I know, because the Puritans did not go away. They just stayed, and they formed different organizations, and they dressed differently, and they became fitness nuts. Quite a few of them became fitness nuts like me. But one of our problems is that Cotton Mather still attends Sierra Club meetings and Wilderness Society meetings and so on. And he's energetic. There's a good reason to have Cotton Mather in your group. But this inadvertent Calvinism creeps in, by which the great Puritan paradox, we are people who live in grace. The rest of humanity lives in darkness, and even good works cannot save them. Well, that explains what was a great mystery to me for a while in Boulder, that quite a number of my most committed environmentalist friends had SUVs and drove SUVs. But now I understand that they drive those in a state of grace. And so I think that changes the emissions in significant ways. So that inadvertent Calvinism, where a not so great political strategy of saying to the American people, you heathen living in darkness, you sinners, you forces of wickedness, and then expecting that to rally the votes. That was kind of an unusual. In fact, in Boulder, one of my good friends, Warren Hearn, actually does directly use the human beings as an infection on the planet. You think, well, that'll get him out on election day. That's pretty good. So we wanted to change the tone, and I hope that you'll see that, and also to change the tone of documentaries, which often can be a little ponderous in themselves. So are we ready to see this? Okay, and I welcome your comments and thoughts. This is a 5-minute promo. We've got another 20 minutes kind of in the can, but we're still in process. So if you have thoughts about this little demonstration, no, this is not the end of my speech. Do not celebrate on this. I will be back up in a moment after this. So see you soon.
That old black magic has me in its spell.
We may not know your name, but we already know one pretty private thing about you. You have been involved in a tempestuous relationship, pursuing a mad romance with fossil fuels. Oh, the wild, wonderful times you've had together, traveling the world in comfort, enjoying exotic cuisine, living like modern royalty.
Tingle that I feel inside. And then the elevator starts its ride.
But now, that old black magic is starting to lose its luster. Money is driving you apart. Quarrels are flaring.
That only a kiss
And it's starting to get a little too hot in the kitchen.
baby down.
Let's face it, your extravagant love affair with petroleum is finally starting to wind down. It's time to go in search of a new relationship, one with better prospects for long-term happiness. We need to talk.
Black magic. Call on.
Before you fell in love with fossil fuels, you used to be so self-reliant. You did everything on your own 2 feet, or with little help from your 4-footed friends. Even so, it took more than a month to get from St. Louis to Denver. Haute cuisine referred to actual oats. And this was the reigning idea of outdoor recreation. Well, let's just say Southern exposure was not a major selling point. What a relief it was to find someone reliable, someone who could really lend you some muscle. Oil, coal, and gas, they were so strong, so generous. Who could blame you for falling head over heels?
I'm a girl who happens to think that a brand new car is better than me.
For better or for worse, the relationship changed every aspect of your life so drastically. It was like becoming a whole new animal. From beaver skin to business attire in a few short generations. It's been quite a ride, hasn't it? And it's natural to feel nervous about the future. But don't overreact. Your concern about the health of your relationship is a good sign. It's a wonderful opportunity, actually, to reassess where you've been and how you're going to move forward in a healthy, happy way. Trust me, you will. The giant leap from natural scarcity to the improbable abundance of energy we enjoy today played out most dramatically in the American West. Today, the West remains the nation's energy treasure chest. With its riches in conventional fossil fuels like coal and natural gas, along with an abundance of water, wind, and solar power, the West represents the leading edge of America's energy future. Whatever happens will happen here first. Join us as we take a look into the past to find out how the first great energy transformation of the Industrial Revolution can inform and guide our next great transition to clean and renewable energy sources and to a new American dream. Well, that is the experiment, and actually, could the lights come up here? If you have a chance at that. well, this will cut my speech off if I can't see this middle-aged problem here. If I can't get the lights, I'm going to be in a little trouble here. Oh. Great, thank you. Anyway, so we've gone on with our filming. We were in Nebraska last week. I was in the Pioneer Patty clothes. I was in a little shed with some goats for one part of the filming. It's a very nice scene where I'm talking about the importance of draft animals in the past, but the audience doesn't know that. And I am speaking earnestly to somebody who's off camera. You can't see who I'm talking to. And I'm saying, remember how it used to be? We used to be so close. I depended on you for everything. You'd work all day in the fields, and then you'd come home, and I'd feed you a nice dinner, and I hold out hay to two big percherons at that point, and they begin munching. So anyway, it's going to be a very interesting show, and if you do have any thoughts about how we can keep up that energy, that's what the PBS affiliates that have seen it have said, it's pretty good. Can you keep that up? Can you sustain that energy? 56 years old, I don't know. So we're trying it. So now what I'd like to do for the next just few minutes is give 10 ideas on suggestions on how to unleash the maximum power of the Rockies to set an example to the nation and the world in energy matters. How to get, these are kind of, I guess they're sort of energy efficiency ideas, how to get the most out of your available power supply as thinkers, citizens, activists, committed citizens. So here are my ideas, and I'll try to get through them in a pretty efficient way here. So first, when nostalgia blocks your view or obscures your vision, stretch your sight to look through nostalgia to a more realistic picture of history and the actual effects of energy production and use. This is to get directly to the big problem that Westerners have had for generations over nostalgia and the way in which nostalgia can bring us to a very undesirable state of fatalism and inaction. And that will play out in the energy scene if we don't watch out. Charles Russell said in, I think it was 1914, speaking of Montana, I liked it better when it belonged to God. It sure was his country when we knew it there. Well, somebody has said something like that probably every 15 minutes in the American West in the last 200 years. Somebody has been expressing that sentiment of, oh, what it was when I first came. An interesting conflation often with the person's period of youth with that golden age there. So it's fine. It's a nice thing to look fondly at the past. But over time, I think that becomes a very power-draining habit of mine, where the only logical conclusion is we live in decline times. We are, the good times are gone, and we are left in an age where fatalism is the only sensible response because the times of adventure are past. So in many ways, I hope this film will be, and I hope in many of our enterprises, we can offer a device which I'll just call the nostalgia blocker. This is not about debunking myth or anything like it. It's just saying that life before fossil fuels, that was not a glorious time. The smell of cities. I tried to persuade the Oakland Museum once when they were doing an exhibit on gold rush camps to have a booth where you could step in, close the door, and smell a gold rush camp. And there was maybe 5 minutes where the people at the Oakland Museum were saying, yeah, we could do that. And I'm thinking, oh, the public health concerns and all that. But if you think about what it was to have all of that manure in cities, horses would frequently just be left on the street when they had expired, that nobody wanted to take the responsibility of removing them. So dead animals, manure, oh boy, that's something to be nostalgic about there. Women's work before fossil fuels, the unbelievable burden of doing the laundry, and this has been part of what I had to do in Nebraska, was go around and, oh man, chop wood, pump water. I actually just had to stand next to the poor soul who was doing all the laundry on that. But that tired me, just to stand next to a poor woman who was actually doing the laundry in a tub and using one of those old plungers and all. Anybody who unilaterally, totally celebrates the end of the fossil fuel era as being inadvertently sexist in doing that. Until you think through what fossil fuel did to women's labor and how much of a reduction and a really grueling burden that was, until you think that through, you're not quite ready yet to start thinking of a post-fossil fuel age. I think it's very important to reckon with the burdens on all sorts of people. Is it a coincidence, to go to an even larger scale, and the answer to this is obviously a rhetorical question, is it a coincidence? No. That the era of fossil fuel use coincided with the era of the abolition of slavery. Is that a coincidence? No. Because fossil fuels so reduced the burden on human muscle in the labor of production of many different things. That it's not an accident that happened. Fossil fuel allowed non-aristocrats to have things that only aristocrats had had before, all kinds of comforts and conveniences that only the most elite of society could have. Those were democratized and made available to others. So before we start thinking about a post-fossil fuel era, I think it's very important to go back to a pre-fossil fuel era and wipe the nostalgia for a golden, whole, organic, better time out of our eyes. And watching some poor soul do laundry by the old methods is a fine way of doing that. Second, and this one this is the only one that you'll despair of, because I said that I had 10 things, and if I did each one as long as I'm going to do this next one, you would despair. But I'm just going to beat this one into the ground, and then I'll move more rapidly through the others. But this is a really important one, so it deserves a little more time. And this is the power unleasher that comes when we rethink and discard a lot of our usual either-or categories, the concepts by which we usually decide who is on what side, what the two sides are, how they are in opposition. So loyalty, my premise here is that loyalty to outmoded, oversimplified categories keeps us from forming alliances in unexpected and therefore powerful ways. So here, let's use some examples. This one is not particularly energy related, but it was a great one for me to just say, oh, Patty, with your best efforts, you still go out into the world with simple-minded expectations of people being able to occupy only one category, and you're thinking you know what that category means. Okay, so I'm in Idaho a year and a half ago. I'm speaking to the Division of Water and Natural Resources staff at the state of Idaho. There are a few farmers there, and I'm certain that I have that psyched out. These are people who are very interested in agricultural water use, and if I do something I have wanted to do for a long time and never done, and I just attack the lawn as hard as I can. As a widow, I had no more petty and irritating burden in life than caring for that stupid lawn. All my troubles in life and that stupid lawn, which I don't have an automatic watering system, I have to go out and move the little sprinkler around. I'd come home and that lawn would go, oh, you're neglecting me. Oh, I'm dying here. And it's just, and all the neighbors know that you're neglecting. Oh, I came to hate that lawn so much and the idiocy of the lawn. And then as I moved into my joyful relationship with my fiance and his children, I started to think, I have to stay home and I can't be over with the kids because I'm watering my lawn. I realized how much quality time we would have with our children if we weren't working on our lawns. And so I thought, this is great. I'm in Idaho. I'm with all these ag people. They will love it if I attack the lawn. So I attacked the lawn with tooth and nail. And then afterwards, immediately after my presentation, I was to be on a panel with 2 or 3 farmers. And one of them came up to me and he said, well, you really hit me where I live. I said, what did I say? He said, well, I'm a farmer. I said, well, yes. And he said, you know what I grow? I went, oh, no. Bluegrass, oh, no. So there was a wonderful moment for me of thinking, oh, I think I have it all figured out. I'm with farmers. They'll join me in contempt for the lawn. Well, no. Any place you look in Western history, you'll be reminded of these blurred categories and the complexity of any individual person's identity. The main categorization that I would like to now attack, as hard as I attacked the lawn in Idaho, is the categorization of utilitarians versus preservationists. If you read Overland Trail diaries of the 1840s and 1850s, good luck in finding that distinction. You'll certainly see utilitarian attitudes in the diaries because people will be looking for water, grass, firewood. But those same people will then often say, this is a beautiful view. Some people will say as they're coming through the Rockies, we wish we had more time to look around. We can't, we have to keep moving. So to say that they were solely utilitarians because they were looking for water, grass, wood is to miss the many passages. My friend Ken Owens at Sacramento State found me an astonishing quotation from a fellow going to the gold rush in 1849 who was very reduced. By the end of his trip, he had barely had shoes to wear, hardly any clothing that was intact, and he was caught by a early snowfall in the Sierras. He was walking through snow, and he wrote in his diary that night, speaking of the views he had seen of the Sierras, he said, these views have been worth all my trouble, sorrow, and pain. And he spells that all weirdly. It's Truble and Pane and so on. And it's just, just after some at least small degree of brutality to flatten him into a utilitarian pioneer and to take a tribute that's way beyond anything I've ever been able to muster when my feet are cold for that kind of love of nature. So the pioneer testimony reminds us that people are more complicated than they seem to be when we have turned them into one or the other. Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, who are often seen as the founders of this split between the preservationist and the utilitarian. John Muir, archetypal preservationist, lover of wild nature. How did he make a living? On ether and mana and so on? No, he married into a family that had an orchard, that lived off an orchard. The most domesticated, pushed around, bullied kind of trees. Ever thank the Lord those orchards are bullied because we all love the fruit that comes from them. But to call that preservationist and not utilitarian, that doesn't make any sense. Gifford Pinchot, often cast as the archetypal utilitarian, as his biographer Charles Miller tells us. On occasion, for instance, in Yosemite, Gifford Pinchot would stand beneath the pounding waterfall just for the immersion of that experience. He was not estimating its hydroelectric power at that time. So the categories are most difficult to apply to any actual historical circumstance. When I was in Grand Teton for an EPA conference a year ago now, I was looking at those Tetons and thinking, you take Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller Jr. out of this picture, and you don't have Grand Teton National Park. Now that's a paradox, isn't it? It's a process of, and of course Standard Oil played its part in Montana history as well. Untangle that, if you can. Untangle the preservationist and the utilitarian themes that made it possible for Grand Teton National Park to come into being with John D. Rockefeller's enormous resources making that happen. On a different class level, my friend Bob Ryder studied the Arco Company town of Wright, Wyoming in the 1970s, and in the midst of that book, Bob Ryder's book, he suddenly has passages where he writes about coal miners in Wright expressing their frustration in the 1970s that they could not have solar power for their houses. These are fellows who work not underground, work on surface mining, but who are saying, well, we're here in a place of enormous sunlight. Solar gain during the days could be huge. Why aren't we having that? So whatever you thought a coal miner was, there's a set of coal miners asking to have solar power. If we think of the way we characterize opposition in our times, we often hear public disputes and energy issues saying that the other side has insisted that we can drill our way out of the energy dilemma, or that side then responding, well, the environmentalist side has said we can conserve our way out of the energy dilemma. Did anyone actually ever say either of those two things? We can conserve our way out of the dilemma. As far as I know, every person who advocates conservation says it's part of a larger, more complicated solution. Every person who advocates drilling in our time says it's a larger picture and more factors than any individual drilling project will have to be involved. So we are wasting our time in parodies of other people's positions in that. My moment of waking up to my discontent with these categories came years ago. We had an interactive website for the center. We had section where we asked people to write the five biggest challenges facing the West. And this was one person responding. Contemplating this response made me think these categories are not sufficient. Okay, one guy, five biggest challenges facing the West. 1, extreme environmentalists dominating land use decisions. Okay, from that you think, okay, we know who this guy is. 2nd, subdivisions encroaching on the last few places to recreate and open spaces. What happened to that guy who was just here? Now he's worried about excessive growth. 3, traffic jams driving to the mountains. Oh, he turned into somebody else. He had a little moment of alchemy there and he became somebody else. 4, real estate that no one but the rich can afford. Well, that's an interesting one. And then as you think, well, okay, so he started off disliking environmentalists, and then he became one, kind of in the middle of things. And then 5th, the federal government's attempt to lock up federal lands and wilderness and national monuments. Well, now he's back. Now the guy we saw at the first, that's all taking place in one head. And yet it sounds like a contentious public hearing, doesn't it? It sounds like a bunch of people all shouting at each other, but it's one guy. So that's when I decided I'm not paying attention to polls until poll takers begin asking the initial question where they say to the person whose opinion they're seeking, they say, are you one of the rare people who is consistent in your principles? Is your conduct actually matched to your principles and ideas, or are you as addled and conflicted and confused as the rest of us? When the pollsters take that question, then I'm paying attention. So anyway, the categories, out. Third, a particular kind of category, I'd like to take a moment suggesting a different attitude towards that. The big story of the last 2 centuries of history, to summarize that, would be the drawing of lines and borders all over the American West. Counties, federal agencies, jurisdictions, and municipal boundaries and state boundaries and all kinds of boundaries, and all the federal agencies with different boundaries. So EPA's Region 8 is not Forest Service is Region 2. Oh no, that would be too simple. We couldn't possibly do that. So all kinds of drawings of jurisdictional lines. And then a circumstance in which we have endless challenges, energy being a principal one, in which the jurisdictional boundaries do not coincide with the issue being wrestled with or reckoned with. So what do we do with that? For people in the know, the phrase interagency cooperation, that's not a boring phrase. For people not in the know, interagency cooperation. For people who know what's going on, interagency cooperation is a hair-raising phrase. It's a phrase that could make you wake screaming in the night if you took it to heart. Go at it, novelists. Write compelling stories of interagency cooperation and scare us to death and bring us to unexpected resolutions. My particular dream of a plot line, which I think could do us all an enormous amount of good, is to take the Romeo and Juliet plot and install it all over the West so that you got your Montagues and Capulets, or the equivalent, but you have your child of a Forest Service supervisor, son of a Forest Service supervisor, daughter of a county commissioner, and they cannot marry and will have to end tragically, but an interagency agreement is negotiated and a MOU saves the day. Or a natural gas producer, the son of a natural gas producer, the daughter of a rancher, a split estate. We need an incredibly well-worked-out partnership with the Shakespeare festivals in the West to produce that in many different places. And that brings me to my fourth point. So the third point still, the jurisdictions are the most persistent of categories and the ones that we most need to think through ways of working and acting across those boundaries. And my fourth point I'd just like to put in, because I am in the humanities, and that Romeo and Juliet thing might have struck you as just manic humor, but literature has extraordinary power. If we're going to talk about the power of the Rockies, one of the things that we have to talk about is literature's great power. In the middle of the 20th century, Joseph Kinsey Howard lamented the fact that Montana had no writers. In around the 1950s, or around 1950, Howard said, "We never had time to develop a Mark Twain or a Bret Harte, and without such a writer, Montana could not become a cultural entity in the national consciousness." Well, that turned around, didn't it? I mean, here we are in Missoula, Montana, and yet I think in some ways the power of literature is still not fully tapped in this cause, that some novels and short stories about interagency conflict and agreements would be worthwhile. The one that I really yearn for, in the 1920s, I forgot the name, it's called Power of Lightning. Anyway, there was actually a novel written about a utility manager. And when I read in David Nye's book about that, I thought, that's what we need, because I have hung out, Rocky Mountain Electric Lead and Colorado Association of Utilities. I have hung out with utility managers, and their personal dramas are extraordinary. And they are in many ways the decision makers and the linchpins in any transition of energy decisions. So the Center of the American West, I would assume in collaboration with the Policy Center here, would like to offer a prize for the best short story written about a utility manager and the compelling human drama of someone making decisions about renewable portfolios and how to sell that to the clientele. So more unleashing of literary power on this, I think, would be another way of enhancing our power. Fifth, I would like to see us all make an effort to re-engineer our relationships with engineers, because it's not good right now. I think our social relationship to the engineering profession for most of the 20th century has been the American people, oftentimes through its elected officials, saying to engineers, get us what we want in the way of material comfort and convenience when we want it at an affordable price, and don't make us see the sites of production or any impact of production. And the engineers, to an extraordinary degree, have said, well, okay, we'll try to do that. And then when it turned out that we could still see the impact of their actions, then we condemned them pretty fiercely for actually having brought us the comfort and convenience that we had asked them to get. I will tell you, in case you wonder where this line of reflection came from, I spoke at a couple of events during the centennial of the Bureau of Reclamation. So you can see the wounds from me from trying to talk to that group over these things. If the engineers made environmental messes, and they did, they made them at our request. There's only the emptiest of joy in condemning technology. And there's, I think, a lot of satisfaction in doing what I have the great joy of doing at the University of Colorado, collaborating with engineering professors and engineering students, and, in fact, taking that wonderful spirit. Is there a problem? Can we do something to fix it? Can we have something to deal with it? But bringing it into a larger social dialogue, political dialogue, cultural dialogue. Novelists, here's another chance. I know if you're in creative writing and you were assigned to write a story about an engineer, you'd look for another major. I know that's the case, but don't give up fast, because their drama is considerable there. Sixth, and of course, the whole reason to do that is to recover from our extraordinary disengagement in this landscape of production, landscape of consumption division. So that the places where energy is produced are so out of sight and so out of mind to the areas where energy is in its majority consumed. What do we do about that? Pen pals, I'm thinking, with the electronic age, just match people up, and at least with digital photography, you could actually have that happen. School children, we used to write to people abroad. Well, in some ways, the rural West and the urban West have become foreign nations to each other, so you might as well say to the children, well, we're going to write to some people in a very distant place. It's 50 miles from town on a ranch. So pen pals might be it. My own particular hope for production consumption disengagement is to see a massive cut in the emissions of hypocrisy and self-righteous inconsistency in the West. If we could have a significant amount of hypocrisy reduction, I think the carbon impacts of that would be great. As inappropriate as it is to say this, wouldn't Senator Craig be well positioned to take up a campaign against hypocrisy and to guide us in this process? Sorry, that was tasteless, I beg your pardon. But now to raise your spirits from that, I will tell a story that often comes to my mind when I'm thinking about this. I had a friend in the Boston area who was summoned to be in a jury in Boston, and he went down to the big courthouse building, and it was like a 12-story building, and it was a hot summer day, and he went in, and he was initially disheartened to see that the air conditioning wasn't working there, so that made him kind of glum. And then it turned out the elevators weren't working either, so he had to walk up to the 7th or 8th floor, and finally he thought, well, I'll go get a drink of water. And he went over to the fountain, and he discovered that the fountains weren't working either. And he said to a man who happened to be standing next to him at the fountain, he said, the way they treat us, you'd think we were the criminals. And the man standing next to the fountain said, well, I am a criminal. So that was an interesting exchange. He thought he'd been talking to another potential juror. Then a little while passed, and he was taken into the courtroom, and the judge then pointed to the defendant, who proved to be the man who had been standing at the water fountain. And the judge said to the prospective jurors, has anyone had any prior acquaintanceship with this man who is the defendant? And this poor friend of mine thought, well, I'm in a tough position. He said, well, yes, I did have a conversation with him. And the judge said, what was the nature of your conversation? He said, well, I'm not sure you really want me to say that. The judge said, oh, you must say it. So he said, well, I was standing at the fountain, and I said, the way they treat us in this building, you think we were the criminals. And he said, I am a criminal. And at that point, all the prospective jurors had heard a prejudicial remark. So they all got to go home. So I guess it's a happy story from that. But that great phrase, if we just practice, maybe just once a week, if we were ever tempted to get on high horses and ride around complaining about other people's energy profligacy and bad behavior, just to try that phrase on, but I am a criminal, and to recognize how complicit we all are in this energy festival. Okay, then seventh item is for us to think as hard and honestly as we can about what we now classify and what we will choose to classify in the future as an intolerable disturbance of the Rockies landscape. What we will tolerate, what we will not tolerate. Because right now, I don't think our conceptualization is quite up to where it's going to need to be if we do take these steps towards renewable energies. This is one estimate, and I know they do vary in different people's points of view, different organizations, but a gas well, natural gas well that produces 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas over time disrupts half an acre. A wind farm producing that equivalent amount of energy disrupts, depending on its construction, 100 to 300 acres. A solar farm producing that amount of energy is 46 acres. A dam producing that much energy is Glen Canyon size, though presumably with more water behind it than that. So if undisturbed landscape is a primary goal, then the cause of renewable energy is in big trouble. But the human mind has capacity to take in information and reflect on it. So that seems to be a place where we really want to think. One of the most wonderful moments in Western history occurred when a bunch of commuters coming north out of Los Angeles had to drive by what was going to be the site of a wind farm, and the commuters, suburban commuters, complained that the wind farm would disrupt the tranquility of their commute. Well, maybe we could deal with that, do you think? So that question, involving some pretty hard-headed questions, which is more disruptive over the long haul of an ecosystem and wildlife habitat, a second home development or a natural gas well pad? Those are questions that we have to ask with some tranquility, but looking hard at our definitions of what constitutes intolerable and tolerable disruption. Plus, of course, we have to be asking for any such development, what are the prospects for remediation and restoration? I'm almost through with my, your spirits are picking up here because we're on number 8. We're coming into port here. So here is a fact of Western history that having this on our minds, I think, would make the Rockies even more powerful in setting a course for the future of energy. I occasionally am in the company of other historians in other fields who will be talking about globalization in the last half of the 20th century and the novelty of globalization. And as a Western historian, I just have to think, I wouldn't call that novelty. The fur trade, the contest of empires in the American West in the early years of the 19th century. When was the West not globalized? When was there, in the last 200 years, when Lewis and Clark are arriving on the Pacific coast and they are hearing words that Indian people have picked up from British and American sailors? Where was the era before globalization, sometime before 1780s, 1790s, and the maritime trade there? This is our advantage. The fur trade, maybe especially in terms of the international participation there, the contest of French, British, and the Scottish and Irish, and of course Indian tribes pulled into all of that, Americans, latecomers, and all that. How can we claim innocence when we are surprised that our decisions must be made in the context of what's happening in China and India? Where did that surprise come from? The fur trade with China was a driving force for the transformation of the Pacific Northwest. So we are, in some ways, the oldest hands at dealing with globalization and thinking about our place and our region in that broadest international context. That should be one of our competitive advantages. Ninth, the word progress doesn't get used as much in this country as it often was in the past, and yet I think it may be the key term in this whole story. Whoever wins the contest over the redefinition of the idea of progress will win the campaign in energy production and consumption. Exhilaration and adventure, the lesson of Western history, I think, must be a part of this. Exhilaration and adventure, not solemn duty and dreary lowered expectations. The choice of energy regimes will be made not by scientific rationality, but by strong human feelings. And for the 19th century West, there is a lesson to us there, because for westward expansion, for many white Americans, individual well-being and national well-being moved on parallel tracks, in fact, really harnessed together tracks. And we had better find a way to recreate that, by which the interests of individuals and the interests of the larger community, including the nation, including the planet, are not in competition with each other, but seen in harmony. And then my 10th item is that we might want to take advantage of abundant opportunities in our lives today to consider the possibility that the current configuration of our major political parties is losing relevance fast. And it's an easy thing for an historian, I don't know if it's easy, but it's a comfortable thing for a historian to say, because we are aware that there have been different party systems in the United States at different times. There were Federalists and Jeffersonian Republican Democrats. There were Whigs and Democrats. There were, even when the Republicans and the Democrats kept their same names, the Franklin Roosevelt era was an age of great political transformation. So there have been big shifts in party structure before, when the parties no longer responded to the on-the-ground dilemmas of people making tough choices. So when you think about, for instance, Stuart Udall's memories of the 1960s bipartisanship that went into so many initiatives in his time, Secretary of the Interior from 1961 to 1969, when he remembers them as very bipartisan eras, and then you remember that he, for instance, dealt with the Democrat, Wayne Aspinall from Colorado, Democrat, who was, well, just say a worthy rival to Stuart Udall in many of his endeavors, and never saw a dam project he didn't love, and so on. That's a Democrat. I went to use a contemporary example, I spoke at the Idaho Conservation League a year ago this summer, and my honored companion, who was beloved by the Idaho Conservation League and made my head spin for a moment or two, but Congressman Mike Simpson, the Republican there who had worked hard on the Boulder White Clouds Initiative, Wilderness Initiative there, was just being hugged and hugged and hugged by folks in Idaho. Well, it's a complicated world, and to go for those usual categories of thinking we know what a Republican is and what a Democrat is on environmental issues, time to give that a little more thought and to wonder whether we're losing relevance there. Okay, a few very quick ideas that are just peculiar and out-of-the-box plans. I'm thinking that one great historical lesson that we might want to draw, Prohibition. They prohibited the public consumption of alcohol in the 1920s, and people drank more than they ever had before. So maybe there's a lesson there. It seems to me that maybe our energy efficiency and conservation report, we should have proposed that the federal government prohibit energy efficiency, and then everyone would want to do it. That's a possibility. It's kind of a counter-suggestible nation. How to get people out of their cars and walking and using public transportation. I look back to my times living in Massachusetts for 4 years, never wanted to drive, always preferred the bus, always preferred to walk or take the bus. Why was that? Was I in a morally higher ground? No, it was not that. It was Boston drivers who scared me to death. So recruit teams, SWAT teams, volunteer SWAT teams of Boston drivers. Tell communities that the Boston driver volunteer team was going to be in town for a particular day. Everybody, only logical thing, I think I'll take the bus. I think I'd be safer on the bus. And then, so they're there, but you don't know when they're coming back, and you have to be very careful and make the right choices because you don't know when those Boston drivers are going to be back. Never have a dinner party without inviting a utility manager there. If you planned your dinner party and you realize you'd forgotten your utility manager, well, if you can get an engineer, that'd be good. You could fill in with that. But never go forward with a plan. If you have filled the table, then get more chairs and add plates and make sure that you have them included. And then, last item here, always keep in mind the improbability of our lives today. So here we have my game. I always ask people to play this little game in their heads when they think about the risks of taking their lives for granted. This game is called Astonish the Immigrant. And in this game, you imagine bringing back a pioneer from the 19th century, and the competition is to find what would be most unexpected. What about our times would make a pioneer think, well, now this is just something we could never have imagined? I think all the obvious things would be not worth trying. I mean, the telegraph is a little bit like the internet. They imagined balloons going from the gold rush, going from the East Coast to the West Coast in the gold rush, so don't bother with airplanes. I used to say, go to a courtroom where a case involving predators is being tried, because every pioneer, every settler wanted to get rid of the predators to protect the livestock. Take the pioneer into the courtroom and say, those lawyers over there? In our time, predators have attorneys. people who went to college and law school. My friend Helena Wall corrected that by saying predators have always had attorneys. What's new in our time is that animal predators have attorneys. So I used to think that was the obvious way to win this competition. I don't think that anymore because now I'm a fitness freak and I have used treadmills. I have known sin. I am a criminal. If there is anything goofier than a treadmill, burn fossil fuels to supply electricity so that we can use our muscles. What could a settler of the 19th century think about that? Now, that's certainly a reminder to us of our improbability, but it is also a reminder that we cannot see the future. Just because something is improbable doesn't mean it can't happen, and I believe that's something we want to have in our minds. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to, well, I have one more glum thing to say, and then I want to conclude on a more uplifting note. Bernard DeVoto from Ogden, Utah, wrote wonderfully about the West, and I was going to talk a bit more about him tonight and then decided just to cut him down to a couple of quotations. He was a person who used heated language. He used the word imbecilic to describe people he disagreed with. When you read Bernard DeVoto, you think, and we're lamenting our lack of civility today? I mean, what was that? When he was a young man, he wrote some very bitter essays about Utah and how he felt about Utah, condemned, oh my goodness, at first I thought it can't have been that bad, and then when I read his essays, I thought, oh, it was that bad. My father had been a young man in Utah at that time, and he had really loved these essays, and so anyway, it was interesting. What's really interesting is that Bernard DeVoto wrote these very bad things about Utah, and then when a man wrote him 20 years later, he wrote a kind of public apology. He said that he had reconsidered his thoughts and decided that he had written far too harshly, that he had been a young man who resented having been snooted at when he was a boy, and that's why he had written those things. And then he allowed that to be printed in the newspaper, his not retraction, but just a reckoning with that. I thought, now that's pretty good. Going on record as having thought one thing and thinking another. We don't see much of that these days. He did the same thing on the issue of whether the West was victimized. In 1934, he wrote a famous essay on the victimization of the West, the plundered province, and it's often quoted as the West is colonized, victimized, abused, extracted from, run over by outside forces. So he wrote that very forceful essay in 1934. 60 years ago, just about now, in 1947, he wrote an essay saying, I got that wrong. A lot of that happened, but in this essay called The West Against Itself, he spoke about the shallowness, the hopelessness, the uselessness of the victim status, and he did a fine job in that essay. If you haven't read it, there's one essay called The American West and the other called The West Against Itself. He really did a nice job of saying, I overstated that victimization thing, and I shouldn't have done it because there's nothing for a victim to do but to go on and be more of a victim. If we can look at ourselves and see our own responsibility, then there's hope. And he has many quotable passages there, but this one I wanted to quote so that we can resolve to prove him wrong in the next century. This is what he said as he's critiquing Western individualism. Western individualism has always been in part a belief that I stand to make more money from letting my neighbor down than from cooperating with him. Westerners have always tended to hold themselves cheap and to hold one another cheaper. Well, let's just prove him wrong. Let's just take the next century. Say it doesn't have to be that way. As probably many people in the room know because of my whining about my lawn, I was widowed 2.5 years ago. My husband died at age 56. For his memorial service, I put at the top of the program a passage from Deuteronomy, the line, I have put before thee life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. And especially over the course of that first year, I said that to myself over and over and over again. I have put before thee life and death, blessing and cursing, and to unleash the power of the Rockies and setting a better pattern of energy production and consumption. Let's go with that one. Therefore, choose life. Thank you. We do have time for a few questions if anybody has any comments on the film or any thoughts or reflections.
And you also have a chance to talk to Patty at the reception at the clerk.
Oh, the conga line at the reception. We have to. You can have excellent conversations in conga lines. Any thoughts, sir? Stand for us. So, well, I think this suggests a particular enthusiasm for attending this reception is my feeling on that. So, therefore choose life, huh? Therefore choose refreshment. So, thank you.